Iran's own president stood up, publicly apologized to America's Gulf allies, and personally promised the attacks on their territory would stop. Within days, the attacks resumed anyway, harder than before, because the man actually running Iran's military told him no. That's not a metaphor, and it's not exaggerated commentary. That's a documented sequence of events straight out of Tehran, and it tells you something genuinely extraordinary about who's actually in charge of Iran right now. Spoiler, it isn't the president, and depending on who you ask, it might not even be the Supreme Leader either. Let's break down exactly how Iran's military establishment ended up openly overruling its own elected government, who's actually pulling the levers of power inside Tehran right now. Why an inaccessible Supreme Leader has made this entire crisis so much worse, and why this internal power struggle might end up mattering more to how this war ends than anything happening on the battlefield. To understand how Iran got here, you have to go back to the opening moments of this entire conflict. Because the leadership vacuum driving everything that's happened since traces directly back to a single devastating night. On February 28th, American and Israeli strikes as part of what's been called Operation Epic Fury killed Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, along with Defense Minister Aziz Nasirzadeh and IRGC Commander Mohammad Pakpour, gutting the very top of Iran's military and political hierarchy in a single coordinated blow. That kind of simultaneous decapitation of a regime's top leadership doesn't happen often in modern warfare, and the aftermath inside Iran has been exactly as chaotic as you'd expect. Within days, Ahmad Vahidi, who had only been serving as deputy commander of the IRGC since late December, stepped into the role of commander-in-chief following Pakpour's death. Here's the detail that should stop you in your tracks. No formal appointment decree for Vahidi as IRGC commander has ever been made public, signed by the new Supreme Leader or otherwise. He simply became the man running Iran's most powerful military institution, without the normal paperwork trail that would typically accompany a transition of this magnitude, in the middle of a country reeling from having its top leadership wiped out overnight. Then, on March 8th, just over a week after his father's death, Mojtaba Khamenei was named Iran's new Supreme Leader. And this is where things get genuinely strange, because Mojtaba has not appeared publicly since assuming that title. Not once. Iranian state media has offered hints of what's been described as a deep internal crisis surrounding him, and both American Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and President Trump have publicly suggested he may be critically ill or disfigured. Some reports have gone further, describing him as being in a coma, surrounded by an IRGC security cordon that controls who gets anywhere near him. His own nickname among Iran watchers, the Phantom of Tehran, tells you everything about how invisible this supposed head of state has actually been during the single most consequential period in Iran's recent history. And here's the detail that matters most for understanding this entire power structure. Ahmad Vahidi is widely believed to be the only senior Iranian official who can actually meet with Mojtaba Khamenei directly. Think about what that means practically. The nominal supreme authority of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the person whose signature and blessing theoretically legitimizes every major decision the government makes, has become almost entirely inaccessible to everyone except the head of the Revolutionary Guard. Whoever controls access to Mojtaba Khamenei controls, for all practical purposes, the ability to speak in his name. That brings us to the man actually running the country day to day, and to the specific incident that gives this entire story its title. President Masoud Pezeshkian, Iran's elected head of government, represents the reformist wing of Iran's political establishment, and he's been an outspoken advocate for reaching a ceasefire, warning privately that Iran's economy faces what he's described as total collapse within weeks if the war continues without resolution. Early in this power struggle, Vahidi ordered IRGC attacks directly against Arab Gulf states. Pezeshkian, understanding the diplomatic catastrophe this represented, publicly apologized to those Gulf governments and personally promised the attacks would not happen again. That's a president using the actual authority of his office to try to walk back a military decision he viewed as strategically disastrous. And then Vahidi severely reprimanded him for it. Not privately, not through some back-channel gesture, but in a way significant enough that multiple Iran-focused intelligence outlets picked it up and reported it clearly. And the attacks on the Gulf states resumed anyway, with even more intensity than before. That sequence right there, a sitting president publicly committing his government to one course of action, and the military simply overriding him and doing the opposite, is about as clean and undeniable an example of military supremacy over civilian government as you're ever likely to see documented in real time during an active war. This isn't an isolated incident either. It's part of a much broader, sustained pattern of Pezeshkian trying to reassert civilian authority and getting rebuffed at nearly every turn. According to reporting from Iran International, Pezeshkian has directly called for executive and managerial powers to be returned to his administration, a demand Vahidi firmly rejected. When pressed on why, the IRGC commander reportedly blamed the current crisis on the government's own failure to implement structural reforms before the war even began, effectively telling the president that the military's expanded authority was a consequence of civilian government failure rather than something Vahidi had any intention of relinquishing. Pezeshkian has also reportedly sought urgent meetings directly with Mojtaba Khamenei on multiple occasions, and every single one of those requests has reportedly gone unanswered. A sitting president of Iran, unable to get an audience with his own country's supreme leader, while the head of the Revolutionary Guard apparently moves freely in and out of that same access. That's not a functioning constitutional hierarchy anymore. That's a government where the formal chain of command exists mostly on paper. It's worth understanding exactly who Ahmad Vahidi actually is, because his personal history adds an important layer to why his rise to this position of unchecked authority is so significant. Vahidi carries an Interpol red notice against his name specifically tied to the 1994 bombing of a Jewish community center in Buenos Aires, an attack that killed 85 people, one of the deadliest terrorist bombings in the history of South America. That's not a minor footnote. That's the specific individual now believed to hold effectively unchecked authority over Iran's military strategy, its economic empire, and through his exclusive access to Mojtaba Khamenei, potentially the entire apparatus of the Iranian state itself. Before stepping into this current role, Vahidi previously served as Iran's Minister of Defense under Ahmadinejad, then later as Minister of the Interior under President Raisi, and into the early Pezeshkian administration, giving him deep, long-standing familiarity with exactly how Iran's civilian government bureaucracy actually functions, and, by extension, exactly how to route around it effectively now that he holds the most powerful military position in the country. He's also publicly demonstrated the kind of hardline instincts that align closely with his current posture, having previously warned Iranian women directly that security forces would punish those breaking hijab compliance rules, a stance that marks him as a genuine ideological hardliner rather than simply a pragmatic wartime military manager who happened to end up in this position by circumstance. The security apparatus surrounding Mojtaba Khamenei tells its own story too, and it reinforces just how tightly controlled access to Iran's nominal supreme authority has become. Reports describe an elite, black-clad security detail specifically tasked with guarding Iran's new supreme leader, a level of physical isolation that goes well beyond ordinary head of state protection and starts to look a lot more like containment. Some of Mojtaba's own associates within his inner circle are reportedly now trying to push out Ali Hijazi, a figure who had opposed Mojtaba succeeding his father in the first place, suggesting that even the small circle of people who do have some access to the supreme leader are themselves engaged in their own internal power struggle over influence and positioning. When you layer that internal circle infighting on top of the broader Vahidi-Pezeshkian rift, what emerges is a genuinely fractured, multi-layered power structure. Not just two sides fighting over control, but several overlapping circles of competing interest, all jockeying for position around a supreme leader who hasn't been seen in public since the day he assumed the title. There's also a revealing episode involving Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf that's worth bringing into this picture, because it illustrates just how uncertain even senior, established Iranian officials have become about their own standing within this fractured system. Israeli media reported at one point that Ghalibaf had been removed from Iran's negotiating team entirely, a claim that, whether fully accurate or not, generated enough uncertainty that Iranian state media felt compelled to push back against it directly. State outlets went so far as to criticize comments made by Foreign Minister IRGC regarding the Strait of Hormuz, accusing him of inadvertently allowing President Trump to claim a public relations victory through his own public remarks. That kind of public state media criticism of a sitting foreign minister's own diplomatic messaging is a remarkably candid signal of just how much internal tension exists, even among officials who are nominally on the same side of this three-way factional split. The pro-negotiation camp itself apparently struggling to stay coordinated and unified even when its members broadly agree on the underlying strategic goal. Because the power shift isn't just about a handful of tense personal exchanges between Vahidi and Pezeshkian, it's been deliberately engineered into the architecture of how Iran's military actually operates. Iran's former security chief, Ali Larijani, reorganized the IRGC's command structure specifically to answer only to the supreme leader, restructuring it into a network of autonomous regional headquarters empowered to make their own operational decisions independently of Tehran's civilian leadership entirely. That's not incidental bureaucratic drift. That's a deliberate architectural choice that hands enormous independent authority to regional IRGC commanders, allowing them to act without needing sign-off from the civilian government at all, as long as they can plausibly claim they're answering to the supreme leader's authority, an authority that, in practice, currently funnels through exactly one man capable of accessing Mojtaba Khamenei directly. It's worth remembering this decentralized structure is precisely why, even as President Trump publicly claimed regime change had effectively occurred inside Iran, the IRGC still managed to maintain its blockade of the Strait of Hormuz for an extended period, disrupting global energy and food markets in the process. A genuinely decapitated, disorganized regime doesn't typically retain that kind of coordinated operational capability, but a regime that's deliberately built around distributed, semi-autonomous military command structures absolutely can, precisely because that capability was never actually centralized in the civilian government to begin with. According to detailed reporting mapping out this internal power struggle, there are now 3 distinct, competing factions actively fighting to shape Iran's negotiating posture and overall war strategy. And understanding all 3 is essential to understanding why this conflict keeps lurching unpredictably between diplomatic openings and sudden new escalations. The first and currently dominant group is what's being called the IRGC Vahidi faction, centered around Vahidi himself and elements of the Revolutionary Guard. And this group is described as currently guiding Iran's overall policy, arguing simultaneously for negotiations while also insisting on retaining total control over the Strait of Hormuz. The second group is a pro-compromise, pro-negotiation faction that includes President Pezeshkian himself, Foreign Affairs Minister Abbas Araghchi, and notably Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf. Analysts studying this divide have made a critical point. This second group doesn't necessarily disagree with the first group over the ultimate goal. Both factions want Iran to retain meaningful control over the strait, but they disagree sharply over the means of getting there, with the Pezeshkian-aligned group favoring negotiated concessions over continued military confrontation. And then there's a third faction sitting even further to the right than Vahidi's group, the ultra-hardline Paidari Front, which opposes any negotiations with the United States whatsoever under any circumstances. That's 3 genuinely distinct centers of power, each with its own read on what Iran should do next, all operating simultaneously inside a government that's supposed to speak with one unified voice on the international stage, but increasingly clearly does not. That factional split explains a huge amount about why Iran's public messaging throughout this war has so often felt contradictory or erratic, alternating between conciliatory diplomatic signals one week and fresh aggressive escalations the next. If you're watching this conflict expecting Iran to behave like a unified state actor making coherent, centrally coordinated strategic decisions, you're going to be constantly confused by what looks like an incoherent, self-defeating pattern of signals. But if you understand that Pezeshkian's foreign ministry might genuinely be negotiating in good faith at the exact same moment Vahidi's IRGC is ordering fresh strikes that undercut those very negotiations, and that a third hardline faction is actively working to sabotage any deal at all, the apparent incoherence starts to make a lot more sense. It's not one government sending mixed signals, it's multiple competing power centers, each pursuing their own strategy simultaneously, occasionally directly contradicting each other in full public view. It's also worth understanding exactly why the IRGC has so much leverage to begin with, because this power struggle isn't purely about who technically holds which title, it's fundamentally about who actually controls Iran's money and Iran's guns. Analysts estimate the IRGC's economic empire accounts for somewhere between 30 and 40% of Iran's entire gross domestic product, an absolutely staggering share of national economic activity concentrated inside a single military institution rather than under civilian government control. That economic footprint spans construction conglomerates, telecommunications infrastructure, oil smuggling networks, and vast informal trading operations that have expanded for decades under successive Iranian administrations. When an institution controls that much of a country's actual economic output, alongside its missile arsenal, its naval forces in the Strait of Hormuz, and its intelligence apparatus, formal constitutional authority starts to matter a lot less than raw operational control. Pezeshkian may hold the title of president, but Vahidi's institution holds the money, the weapons, and, as that Gulf States incident demonstrated clearly, the actual final word on what Iran's military does next, regardless of what the elected government promises. There's a deeper structural reason this shift has been able to happen so cleanly and so quickly, too, and it connects directly back to how the IRGC has operated for decades, even before this specific war began. This organization founded Hezbollah in Lebanon back in 1982, dramatically expanded its domestic economic empire under the Ahmadinejad presidency, played the central role in violently suppressing the 2009 Green Movement protests through its Basij militia network, and has repeatedly inserted itself directly into the machinery surrounding Iran's nuclear negotiations going back through multiple administrations. One defense analysis described what's happening right now bluntly, describing the war as having compressed what would ordinarily be a slow 40-year creeping seizure of power into just a matter of weeks, an assessment that captures just how much this crisis accelerated a process that was already quietly underway long before the first strikes of this war ever landed. The IRGC didn't suddenly invent a strategy for sidelining civilian authority during this conflict. It simply found the perfect chaotic conditions, a decapitated leadership, a barely functional supreme leader, and a war footing that conveniently justifies concentrating emergency authority to finally complete a project decades in the making. And it's not just happening quietly behind closed doors either. There's real damning documentary evidence of exactly how deeply the IRGC's operational planning has become embedded into everyday Iranian civilian life. Evidence that reinforces just how independently and comprehensively this institution now operates. A leaked internal directive from the IRGC's Missile Command, shared with Iran International by a hacktivist group and marked very confidential, laid out in extraordinary bureaucratic detail a structured, documented system for identifying, maintaining, and using civilian locations specifically to conceal and support missile launch operations. This wasn't some improvised wartime workaround thrown together under pressure. The 33-page document contained detailed sections on site identification and coding, inspection of access routes, record maintenance protocols, and clearly defined responsibilities spanning intelligence, operations, engineering, communications, safety, and counterintelligence functions. That's the language of an established, standing institutional system, one that had clearly been developed and refined over a long period well before this specific war forced it into active use. When a military institution has that level of independent, sophisticated, bureaucratically formalized operational infrastructure built entirely outside of civilian government oversight, you start to understand why Pezeshkian's request to simply have executive authority handed back to his administration was never going to be something Vahidi would seriously entertain. The international response to this shift in Iran's power structure has been notable too, and it reflects just how seriously outside governments are taking the IRGC's consolidation of authority. Back in February, just days before the second wave of Israeli and American strikes against Iran began, the Council of the European Union formally designated the IRGC, including its Quds Force and affiliated networks, as a terrorist organization, imposing continent-wide asset freezes and financial restrictions across every EU member state. That designation came on top of extensive existing American sanctions the organization had already been operating under for years. What's notable is the timing. The EU moved to formally blacklist the IRGC, specifically in the window right before this latest escalation, suggesting European intelligence services were already tracking the organization's expanding domestic control and wanted the legal and financial tools in place before the situation inside Iran got any more complicated to navigate diplomatically. There's also no reliable, independently verified figure for total IRGC personnel at this point, though official Iranian statements suggest its training and mobilization capacity, spanning coordination units, ideological political structures, and the broader Basij militia network, can exceed 220,000 individuals annually, giving you some sense of just how vast the manpower base underpinning this institution's authority actually is, well beyond its formal standing military units alone. It's also worth noting that Vahidi isn't the only senior figure whose position has shifted dramatically since this power struggle accelerated. Ali Larijani, the very official who had originally reorganized the IRGC into those autonomous regional headquarters answering only to the Supreme Leader, was himself removed from his post as Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council in mid-March, just days after that restructuring had already taken effect, replaced by Mohammad Bagher Zolghadr. That's a genuinely striking detail. The architect of the exact command structure that's now enabled Vahidi's rise to unchecked authority was pushed out of his own senior position almost immediately after implementing it, suggesting that even among Iran's most senior hardline security officials, this period has been marked by rapid, unpredictable turnover rather than any kind of stable, coordinated transition of power. When the people responsible for redesigning a country's military command structure can't even guarantee their own job security in the aftermath, it tells you just how volatile and fluid the entire situation inside Tehran's ruling establishment has actually become. Stepping back to look at the historical pattern here, what's unfolding inside Iran right now actually fits a recognizable template that's played out in other revolutionary states facing severe external military pressure, combined with a sudden leadership vacuum at the very top. Militaries with pre-existing parallel command structures, independent economic interests, and deep ideological investment in a state of permanent conflict tend to expand their authority dramatically during exactly this kind of crisis, and they tend to be extremely reluctant to hand that authority back once emergency conditions start to ease. One Western intelligence assessment cited by Israeli media put it about as bluntly as an assessment like that ever gets phrased, concluding that what's taking shape in Iran is no longer an Islamic republic in its original constitutional sense. but something closer to a military junta in every meaningful respect, with the formal trappings of civilian government, a president, a parliament, ministries, still nominally in place, but with the actual decision-making authority increasingly concentrated inside a single military institution answering to an inaccessible figurehead. Whether that assessment proves to be an accurate long-term description of Iran's political system, or simply an accurate snapshot of an unusually chaotic wartime moment that eventually stabilizes back toward something resembling the old order, is genuinely one of the more consequential open questions hanging over the second half of this entire conflict. This has real, practical implications for how American and Allied negotiators need to think about this entire war, and it's worth spelling out directly. Traditional diplomacy assumes you're negotiating with a government that can actually deliver on whatever it agrees to, a basic assumption that simply doesn't hold when the person sitting across the table from you may not have the institutional power to make his own military stand down even when he's personally committed to exactly that outcome. Any future ceasefire framework, any negotiated settlement over the Strait of Hormuz, any nuclear agreement, all of it runs into the same fundamental problem that already sank Pezeshkian's apology to the Gulf states. An agreement is only as good as the willingness of Iran's actual power holder to honor it. And right now, that power holder has clear institutional incentives to keep this conflict simmering, rather than resolve it cleanly. That's precisely why some analysts studying this dynamic have specifically recommended keeping a direct diplomatic channel open with Mojtaba Khamenei himself whenever possible, and avoiding any public statements that might humiliate him personally, on the theory that anything making his emergence as a credible independent national leader politically impossible only ends up strengthening Vahidi's position further by default. It's a genuinely difficult diplomatic tightrope, trying to empower a supposed head of state who hasn't been seen in public in months, specifically to counterbalance the influence of the military commander who currently controls access to him. Let's talk about what all of this actually means for the war itself, and any realistic path toward a lasting resolution, because this internal power struggle isn't just a fascinating side story, it's arguably the single biggest obstacle standing between this conflict and any kind of durable ceasefire. Every previous diplomatic opening in this war has run into the exact same fundamental problem. Whoever the United States or its allies negotiate with on the Iranian side may simply lack the authority to actually deliver on whatever they agree to. Pezeshkian has been identified directly by President Trump as a point of contact for potential negotiations, but according to detailed analysis of Iran's internal power structure, he lacks the authority to commit Iran to anything meaningful without Vahidi's explicit approval first. That's an almost impossible diplomatic position to negotiate from, agreeing to terms with a government official who then has to go back and convince the actual military power broker to honor whatever was agreed to, a broker who has already demonstrated, through the Gulf States incident, that he's fully willing to override the president's public commitments whenever he judges it strategically necessary. This dynamic also helps explain a strategic reality worth naming directly. The IRGC's own institutional survival is now deeply tied to the continuation of this exact conflict rather than its resolution. Analysts studying this power structure have pointed out plainly that the IRGC's economic empire, its political supremacy, and its entire revolutionary justification for existing all depend fundamentally on maintaining the narrative of a permanent, ongoing struggle against the United States and Israel. A genuine, lasting peace agreement doesn't just end the war, it potentially removes the single greatest justification the IRGC has for its own expanded wartime authority over Iran's economy, its military, and now increasingly its civilian government functions as well. That creates a deeply uncomfortable incentive structure sitting at the very center of Iran's negotiating position. The faction currently holding the most actual power inside the country has real institutional reasons to prefer continued confrontation over a settlement that might require handing authority back to civilian institutions once the emergency conditions justifying military control finally lift. There is one scenario worth mentioning that analysts have flagged as at least theoretically possible, even if the probability attached to it remains relatively low. Some assessments describe a potential path toward what's been labeled regime fracture, where continued economic collapse, combined with sustained military setbacks and the fading of any initial rally around the flag sentiment among the Iranian public, eventually causes Iran's elite power structure to genuinely fragment. In that scenario, Pezeshkian would attempt to invoke his constitutional authority directly against what he'd frame as IRGC overreach, triggering an open, formal confrontation between the elected civilian government and what's increasingly being described by outside observers as a functioning military junta operating underneath the Islamic Republic's traditional constitutional facade. Whether Pezeshkian actually has the institutional backing, the public support, or simply the raw nerve to attempt something that direct against an organization that controls a third or more of the entire national economy remains genuinely uncertain, And most analysts continue to treat that specific outcome as one of several possible paths, rather than the most likely one. What's far more likely, based on everything documented so far, is that this power struggle continues grinding along in the background exactly as it has been. Three competing factions pulling Iran's overall strategy in different directions simultaneously, with Vahidi's IRGC faction holding the practical upper hand for as long as wartime conditions continue to justify its expanded authority. That has direct, immediate consequences for anyone trying to predict where this war goes next. Every reported diplomatic breakthrough needs to be weighed against the very real possibility that whoever agreed to those terms on Iran's side may not actually have the institutional power to make them stick, exactly as happened when Pezeshkian's public apology to the Gulf states got overridden and reversed within days. And every apparent moment of restraint or de-escalation coming out of Tehran needs to be understood against the backdrop of an internal power structure, where the single most powerful actor has genuine institutional incentives to keep this conflict simmering, rather than see it resolved cleanly. It's worth remembering that the tension between Iran's elected civilian government and its Revolutionary Guard has always been baked into the very design of the Islamic Republic since its founding in 1979, never fully resolved even in peacetime, which is part of why this current crisis has been able to escalate as fast and as cleanly as it has. The IRGC was created specifically as a parallel force to the country's conventional military, answerable directly to the Supreme Leader rather than to the elected president. Precisely so, it could act as an ideological guardian of the revolution, independent of whatever government happened to be in power at any given moment. That structural design, a military institution deliberately built to operate outside normal civilian oversight, has always meant Iran's presidents have had to negotiate and compromise with the Guard, rather than simply command it, even in periods of relative political stability. What this war has done isn't invent that tension out of nothing. It's stripped away decades of accumulated diplomatic convention and informal power-sharing arrangements that had kept the friction between these two centers of authority mostly below the surface, exposing the raw structural reality that was always there underneath the Islamic Republic's constitutional facade the entire time. So here's what I want to know from you. Do you think Pezeshkian's civilian government still has any realistic path toward reasserting meaningful authority over Iran's military and economy? Or do you think Vahidi's IRGC faction has already consolidated its grip on power too thoroughly to ever meaningfully hand that authority back, war or no war, ceasefire or no ceasefire? Drop your honest take in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of internal power dynamic that rarely gets the attention it deserves compared to the missile strikes and the naval blockades, even though it might genuinely determine how and whether this entire war actually ends. If this breakdown helped you understand who's actually making the decisions inside Tehran right now, and why that matters so much more than most coverage of this war usually accounts for, go ahead and hit like on this one. It genuinely helps detailed sourced analysis like this reach more people trying to actually understand this conflict at the level it deserves, rather than just tracking the latest airstrike headline. Subscribing means you'll be right here as this power struggle inevitably keeps developing. And given how quickly Vahidi has already demonstrated a willingness to publicly override his own president, the next flashpoint in this internal rift likely isn't far away. And if you know anyone who's been following this war but assumed Iran was still operating as a single, unified decision-making government this entire time, share this with them, because understanding this fractured, competing power structure inside Tehran is genuinely the key to understanding why this conflict keeps behaving so unpredictably, no matter how many ceasefires get proposed or how many diplomatic breakthroughs get announced. Thanks for watching all the way through. Stay close to this one, because a government this deeply divided against itself rarely stays quiet for long, and whatever happens next between Pezeshkian and Vahidi is going to shape this entire war far more than most people currently realize. Between an inaccessible supreme leader, a military commander with an Interpol red notice now effectively running the country, a president who can't even get a meeting with his own head of state, and a third hardline faction actively working to torpedo any deal at all, this is one of the most consequential and least understood threads running underneath this entire conflict. And it deserves to be followed just as closely as the airstrikes making the headlines every night.